The Midlands winter gnawed like a tired wolf at the edges of the hedgerows, leaving frost where breath touched the air and turning the soil near Daventry into a colour between iron and ash. From a distance the sight was unremarkable. A muddy field, a battered Bedford van braced against the chill, 2 men hunched over a crate-borne oscilloscope whose pale glow fought the dawn. Yet here, in this unceremonious patch of English countryside, the future of air defence was being written in the hush between heartbeats. Inside the van, Arnold "Skip" Wilkins ran a sleeve across his nose and leaned closer to the cathode ray tube. The hum of vacuum tubes mingled with the faint hiss of wind through loose metal seams. His pencil tapped a notepad in an irregular rhythm, half anticipation, half nerves. He had done the mathematics. If radio energy could wrap around the curve of the Earth, bouncing from the ionosphere, then some part of that energy must scatter back when it struck solid metal, moving through air. It was theory, elegant and austere. Today, it would face weather, static, old brake linings, and the doubts of the Air Ministry. Just outside, pacing with the anxious grace of a man who knew that decades of British security might pivot on a flicker of light, Robert Watson-Watt tugged his coat tighter. The wind slapped the hem like an impatient critic. He was already rehearsing the phrases he might have to say later. If the experiment failed, if the aircraft could not be seen, if the Air Ministry, so recently sceptical about death rays, demanded proof. "Any sign?" he asked through the van door, voice muffled by scarf and worry. "Noise floor's steady," Wilkins called back. "If there's a bird or two about, they are not metal." Watson-Watt's mouth twitched. This was not the time for levity, but humour had always been his foxhole. To the northeast, invisible through the low cloud, the BBC shortwave transmitter at Borough Hill broadcast its voice into the continent, a continuous roar of energy that would, if Wilkins' figures held, paint the sky with invisible illumination. 10 kilowatts, a floodlight of electrons, and somewhere above that sky, circling in great lazy orbits, was a Handley-Page Hayford biplane bones, open cockpit, and engines that throbbed like exhausted lungs. It was a relic already, but a reliable one. The RAF crew inside, leather-clad and stiff-fingered, called down occasional reports on position, altitude, and heading. Their voices crackled through the wireless, with the clipped calm of men accustomed to cold cockpits and experimental orders. Wilkins adjusted a knob with surgeon's delicacy. The trace on the screen drifted, wavered, settled. Time stretched, the universe condensed to a moving dot of phosphor, a blip, then gone. He froze. Nothing. A false ghost? Thermal noise? He bit his lip and watched again, muscles coiled. Another blip, faint, transient, like a heartbeat suppressed beneath static. "Robert!" His voice thinned with both fear and electricity. "Come look!" Watson-Watt leaned in, his breath fogging in the van's cold interior. The green trace crept horizontally, and then there it was, a deflection, a tremor that did not belong to nature. "That is not random," Wilkins swallowed. "If the aircraft holds the same course, next sweep should— there, again. Slight but rhythmic, timed with what the Hayford had signalled minutes earlier." For a moment neither man moved. Then the emotion struck like thunder in silence. "Arnold," Watson-Watt said slowly, a grin blooming like spring in hard soil, "we have just seen an aeroplane by means of radio." It was not yet called radar. That word would come later, across an ocean. Here, it would wear a cloak and dagger name RDF, Radio Direction Finding, an elegant euphemism, a protective lie. Something that looked like navigation but whispered of detection, a shield disguised as a compass. Outside, the van, the February wind had not learned to celebrate. It simply pressed on, indifferent to history. But inside, history was exhaling into life. The mathematics, the transmitter, the Hayford's slow heartbeat overhead, suddenly they were not speculation but signal. The difference between chance and pattern, between Britain blind and Britain armed with foresight. They ran the test again, and again, Each time the oscilloscope pulse answered the sky with a small, defiant flicker. The bomber would not always get through, not if an invisible curtain could be stretched across the Channel skies, not if Britain could see beyond the horizon of human senses. Wilkins scribbled figures, framing the amplitude, sketching the actual detection range. It was crude, primitive, a seed rather than a sword. But he knew. Watson-Watt knew. There are moments when the air itself changes texture, when the future leans closer, curious. The Air Ministry car arrived after midday, tires sinking slightly into mud. Two officials in long coats, hats low, faces structured by the fatigue of bureaucracy and looming war. They were not men given to wonder. But Wilkins beckoned them into the van and pointed, "Watch the sweep." The Hayford obligingly radioed its next leg. The trace moved, trembling slightly, then blink. Deliberate, alive. One official leaned backward instinctively, as if proximity to a new reality required space. The other whispered, "Good Lord." Watson-Watt kept his tone mild. "We propose a chain, coastal, linked stations, warning time, several minutes before enemy aircraft reach British soil. Minutes, in modern war, minutes are lifetimes. Ground crews warmed engines, pilots strapped goggles, radios filled with course vectors and height calls. Minutes could spell the difference between scrambled defence and bombed cities. Between smoke rising from Kent and fire in London's heart, the officials nodded, half convinced but shaken. They left with their collars high, and their minds racing toward reports, committees, signatures. When their car vanished down the rutted lane, Watson-Watt stood in the quiet, gazing at the transmitter mast against a bruised afternoon sky. "Arnold," he murmured, "I suppose we had better build the thing." Wilkins laughed softly. "A chain across the coast? That will take everything." Watson-Watt blinked frost from his eyelashes. "Then we will give everything." Night crept in, the equipment clicked and warmed down. Somewhere high above, the Hayford turned home, its crew unaware that they had just opened a new chapter in human perception, a world where the unseen could be mapped, where warning replaced surprise, where mathematics and magnets and metal towers would hold the first fragile line against storms yet unloosed. Daventry's fields returned to quiet. But a faint ghost remained an echo not of radio, but of revelation. Britain had begun to see with invisible eyes, and in the years to come, those early pulses would become a chain that held. The summer that followed Daventry was one of chalk dust, sea wind, and hurried pencils scraping maps. Britain's southern edge had always been a shoreline. Now it was to become a listening wall, a chain, a quiet arm raised against the storm that seemed to be forming across the Channel. The Air Ministry's approval arrived in the understated prose of Whitehall, authorization for experimental RDF stations along the coast. Experimental, temporary, skeleton form. The language of bureaucracy had disguised revolutions before. This would be another. Chain home, the name whispered among engineers, sounded rustic, almost domestic. A chain home, as if forged links were to keep cattle rather than Messerschmitts at bay, but the words hid a new species of fortress. At Orfordness, on the Suffolk coast, the sea breathed in salt and small pebbles. The air there tasted like metal and mist. Engineers unfurled spools of copper, drove timber, piles, and strung wires across masts like harps waiting for thunder. The first towers were not yet the steel giants to come. They were improvised defenders, born of rationed budgets and urgency, their backs braced against the wind like lanky sentinels uncertain of their own power. Watson-Watt strode through the sand with his coat flaring. He looked, someone once said, like a man permanently late to his own invention, yet his eyes sharp behind wire-rim spectacles missed nothing. He saw the tension in the wires. He saw the distance between theory and ground. He saw the German horizon, growing darker. Signals, he reminded anyone within earshot, do not respect optimism. We will build for reality, not reassurance. Arnold Wilkins oversaw oscilloscopes set up under canvas shelters. Young technicians, fresh from the universities and the Royal Aircraft Establishment, adjusted valves, tapped gauges, learned to read the language of noise and signal. They had names not yet, famous: Edward Bowen, energetic and combustible; Charles Wright, quiet and precise; E. M. Farron, whose pipe smoke curled above schematics like incense. They were mathematicians and wireless men, suddenly transformed into sentinels. They worked in shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, chalking formulae onto beach boards, then wiping them off as the tide crept nearer. Trucks rumbled in with fresh spools. Batteries arrived in crates stenciled with cryptic codes, disguised as humble supplies. Officially, they were testing radio direction-finding aids for navigation. Unofficially, they were wiring the future. But the air itself resisted certainty. Every hour the sea hissed a reminder: nature is unruly, noise is endless, certainty must be fought for. One afternoon, a signal hiccuped. The trace spiked violently, then smeared into chaotic waves. An experimenter cursed softly. "Lightning storm over Holland," Wilkins murmured, recognizing the pattern faster than any instrument. Even the weather fights secrecy. They logged it. They logged everything. They learned that sunspots hissed like boiling water, that fishing boats were ghosts on the ether, that ionospheric layers rose and fell like lungs in sleep. Knowledge accumulated like steel plate, heavy, hard, unglamorous, indispensable. By September, the first crude detection arcs were drawn on map boards, not theoretical arcs, now real ones. Miles of sea observed through invisible beams, aircraft tracked not by the eye but by equations. Visitors came uniforms and cautious questions. Air Commodore Sir Hugh Dowding arrived one windy morning, coat buttoned to the throat, gaze austere but inquisitive. He watched the green trace flicker across the oscilloscope. A faint pulse appeared, then another, each punctuated by the distant hum of an aircraft engine somewhere over the sea. "That is a machine?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Watson-Watt replied. "At perhaps 30 miles. Dowding's eyebrows rose a Dowding fraction. He was not a man given to outbursts, but in that thin upward curve was something like hope, and in his clipped voice, a decision already forming. "You will have what you need," he said simply. He would defend these strange aerial sentinels to his superiors, to Parliament, to anyone who doubted, for he had seen what many of his generation feared, the bomber shadow stretching across Europe. And here, in chalk and signal, lay the first counterstroke. As autumn damp settled in, the masts grew taller. Steel replaced timber, permanent huts replaced canvas, power cables snaked underground. The skeleton was gaining bones. A chain was becoming real link by link, mast by mast. But secrecy pressed in like fog. Workers were told partial truths. Locals muttered about mysterious radio tests. A fisherman swore he had heard German voices on the wind near the towers, and promptly reported a phantom spy ring. In the public eye, Britain was still a peacetime island dotted with experimental wireless huts. In truth, it was beginning to bristle like a hedgehog sensing a predator. One evening, back at Orfordness, the sun sank in a molten bar over the North Sea. Wilkins and Bowen stood in silence, watching gulls wheel against the twilight. The towers loomed awkward, raw, half-born, but they hummed faintly, alive with power. "Do you think they will ever know?" Bowen asked softly. "When the time comes, will they know what started here?" Wilkins shook his head. "If we succeed, they will not think about us at all. They will simply live." The wind carried the scent of salt and solder and damp sand. Beyond the wire fences, waves whispered against the shingle. Each pulse from the transmitter leapt into the darkening air like a heartbeat. Britain was learning to listen to the sky. And though few knew it, a new kind of wall was rising, not of stone or concrete, but of electrons and will. A wall that did not block but foresaw, a defense not of steel alone, but of time itself. Soon, radar stations would dot the coast like runes. Soon, young women at plotting tables would chart hostile echoes long before engines were heard. Soon, pilots would scramble, guided by invisible hands. But here, in 1935, it was still fragile, experimental, half-believed. Yet in every hum and pulse lay the quiet certainty of those who built it. Snow crusted the fields north of London in the first days of 1936, and fog lay stubborn as wool across the Thames estuary. Britain looked unchanged: cathedrals, hedgerows, brass buttons polished for parade, but beneath the surface the land was wiring itself for war. The chain home sites multiplied quietly: Bawdsey, Dover, Canewdon, Dunkirk, Kent, not France, Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, each mast pair rising like unfinished organ pipes against the sea-grey horizon. Yet radar alone would not save Britain. It needed a brain. In a nondescript building at Bentley Priory, an unlikely alchemy took place. Mathematics, telephones, women's intuition, and Dowding's uncompromising vision shaped raw signal into strategy. The room smelled of hot valves, pencil graphite, and damp wool. Maps covered tables like stretched parchment, chalked flight lines spider-webbed across the Channel coast. A blackboard bore terse notes: height, speed, friend or foe. It was here that the filter room, the unseen heartbeat of British air defence, came alive. Young women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force arrived in waves, fresh from training at Cranwell and Innsworth. They were called plotters, though they plotted no conspiracies. They plotted survival. Fingers on croupier rakes, they slid coloured arrows representing tracks, hostile, friendly, unknown, across the vast command map. They listened to clipped telephone reports from coastal stations, transcribed hurried bearings, then translated those into living geometry. They moved in constant small motions, shoulders square, voices steady even as adrenaline traced a line beneath their skin. Above them, on a raised dais, controllers watched like chess masters. Squadron to readiness, scramble, 2 sections. Vector 090, Angels 15, words that would become legend. But here, in these early months, they were still language under construction. Nothing in military history had prepared anyone for this. Armies had marched to drums, ships had fought by line of battle traditions, but air defence demanded something new: anticipation instead of reaction, seconds as weapons. "Gentlemen," Dowding had said at one internal briefing, voice dry as vellum, "we must not merely see the enemy, we must see him early enough to choose the moment of contest. Time is our weapon as surely as the interceptor." Chain home gave distance. Filter stations turned distance into decision. The first intrusions came like tests of British nerves, not bombs yet. Just reconnaissance flights, Heinkel, shadows crossing the channel like curious vultures. The air staff called them weather aircraft. No one believed that fiction for long. One morning in late winter, the needles quivered at Canewdon. "Possible echo northeast, long range," a duty officer said. The signal was faint, nearly lost beneath ionospheric noise, but the direction was clear, across the North Sea, from Germany. The filter room's telephone jangled. Coordinates translated, altitude estimated, thin data, but data nonetheless. Dowding walked the room, hands clasped behind him, shoes soundless on the gallery floor. "Do not intercept," he ordered. "Do not reveal our hand." A Spitfire squadron at Hornchurch sat primed on dispersal, pilots leaning in cockpits, eyes eager. They stayed grounded. Britain had seen the intruder. That was victory enough. To scramble now would tell Berlin that something uncanny watched the sky. Across the sea, the German pilot returned home and filed a report that Britain remained as blind as ever. He was wrong. By spring of 1937, the system stretched like a net. The masts, steel now, not timber, rose to 200 feet. Cables buried, power lines duplicated, backup generators installed. A lattice of vigilance hardened. Engineers catalogued quirks, ground clutter ghosts, sea returns, ducting that bent beams strange in summer heat. They adjusted frequencies, rewired receivers, built calibration aircraft circuits. They argued, furiously sometimes, about gain and attenuation, about display persistence and pulse repetition. Behind every echo lay labor invisible to pilots who would one day trust those echoes with their lives. Arnold Wilkins once remarked, in the tone of a man explaining sunrise to a skeptic, "The enemy will not defeat mathematics." Edward Bowen countered, "Provided our valves don't burn out first." Both were right. The people changed too. The technicians gained a watchfulness that never left their eyes. Plotters learned patience sharpened by fear. Controllers developed a clipped calm, speaking as though every syllable cost fuel. Young pilots visiting Bentley Priory for briefings felt humbled. They were lions, but these quiet rooms were the forest that guided them, the hidden hand on every throttle. Secrecy thickened like lacquer. Officially, it was all RDF range and direction finding, a phrase chosen to mislead as much as describe. Radar, the word itself, had not yet been born. Notices warned of silence. Curious questions earned polite evasion. Even within the RAF, only those who needed to know were told the scale of the project. When asked by a member of Parliament whether strange towers on the coast might interfere with local broadcasting, one Air Ministry officer replied blandly, "A coastal communications experiment." In truth, Britain was building the first modern information weapon. Then came 1938, a year heavy with foreboding. German rearmament boomed. Austria fell. In September, Munich trembled under the weight of desperate diplomacy. While the world listened to Chamberlain speak of peace for our time, the engineers at Bawdsey worked through the night, expanding transmitter arrays, refining receiver beams, strengthening lattice towers. Peace, they knew, was temporary. Radar was permanent. During one dusk exercise that autumn, a formation of RAF bombers tried to slip past the net. Chain homes saw them. Filter rooms tracked them. Controllers vectored hurricanes precisely to intercept. The attackers never reached their objective. Pilot after pilot landed at Manston or Debden, shaking heads in grudging awe. "If the Germans have nothing like this," one flight leader muttered, "they will never surprise us." It was not boast, it was calculation. On a raw March morning in 1939, months before war would officially begin, Dowding stood again in the filter room. The map below him was quiet, ops boards set to peace, yet his face held the tension of a man reading storm clouds. A junior WAAF plotter, barely 20, asked softly during a lull, "Sir, do you truly think this will work?" Dowding regarded the sprawling web of wires, telephones, maps, and human resolve. "My dear," he said, "it must." Behind him, the masts faced east like spears, waiting. Beyond them, across the narrowing water, the Luftwaffe trained, prepared, boasted. Britain was not ready in guns or aircraft or numbers, but it could see. And in the years just ahead, years of fire and sirens and sky-torn mornings, that sight would be the thin, hard line between ruin and resistance. The lightning that heralds a storm is often silent at first. So it was in the summer of 1939. Britain still breathed peace narrow, fragile, and already fraying, but the air along the coast quivered with invisible vigilance. The chain home towers stood completed now, steel ribs against gull-streaked sky, humming with restrained electricity. They looked skeletal, half-finished to the untrained eye, but they heard more than stone fortresses ever could. At Bawdsey Manor, once a quiet estate, and now the unlikely nerve chamber of secret scientific war, dawn brought the smell of wet grass and solder. The manor's Georgian windows reflected rising sun over the estuary, while inside, a young radar mechanic named Jean Laidlaw checked a receiver panel, tapping valves gently like a nurse testing a sleeping patient's pulse. "Valve temperature's stable," she murmured. Behind her, a cigarette smouldered forgotten in an ashtray, curling smoke into a room of blueprints, mugs, and a chalkboard crowded with equations that looked like incantations. Doctor Edward Bowen, sleeves rolled, hair untamed, leaned over her work. "Good. Keep those filaments happy, Jean. If one burns out, we don't just lose a dot, we lose minutes." And minutes, in the kind of war forming over Europe, were lives. The first enemy raid had not yet come. But the first enemy presence had already brushed British airspace reconnaissance flights, Heinkel shadows, Dornier outlines. Chain home stations watched them like a doctor tracing a patient's pulse after a fever spike, tense, observant, certain of relapse. Pilots stationed at Tangmere, North Weald, Hornchurch stood ready in canvas dispersal huts. Their Hurricanes and Spitfires gleamed in early light, each cockpit glass catching gold. They did not yet know how much they would owe the quiet coastal towers, how many times that eerie green pulse on a cathode ray tube would give them just enough time to climb, to intercept, to survive. On the 1st of September, 1939, the war came not as surprise but as confirmation. Hitler crossed into Poland. Radios at Bawdsey crackled not with echoes but with news bulletins. In London, Chamberlain's voice carried a grave calm that could not disguise inevitability. Consequently, this country is at war with Germany. In the filter and plotting rooms, the women and men exchanged glances, not cheers. They simply resumed, more intently, what they had already been doing, listening to the sky. Chain home did not fire shells or drop bombs. It did something stranger, quieter, and more radical. It dissolved ignorance. It replaced fear of the unseen with measured knowledge. Each pulse out to the horizon returned with shape and speed. Each trace whispered, "You are not blind." In those first months, bombers rarely came. Instead, U-boats, mine-tossers, and reconnaissance crews crept along the coast. Radar caught them. Reports flowed like blood through arteries from station to filter room, from filter to Group HQ, from HQ to Squadron Scramble Bell. Wind whipped around the towers at Dunkirk. Kent, a cruel name coincidence waiting for history to provide its tragic echo the next spring. The operators there learned the music of war before hearing a single shot. They learned ionospheric singing, sea clutter hiss, the fluttering ghosts of fishing trawlers and windmills. They learned to hear the one noise that mattered, the heartbeat of an engine coming across the sea. At times, the screens erupted in phantoms. Spring ducting created false fleets. Lightning in the North Sea burst like invisible artillery across the displays. A novice could panic, misinterpret, cry wolf. It took discipline to see through chaos, to hold every echo to scrutiny. Wilkins once wrote in a margin note, "Our enemy is not the bomber alone. Our enemy is uncertainty." April 1940. The quiet before the avalanche. The phony war, newspapers called it. In London, blackout curtains still smelled of new cloth. Ration books grew worn from opening more than from need. But near chain home sites, there was no illusion. Radar logs filled with increasing frequency, German reconnaissance over the Channel, patrols shadowing shipping lanes, Luftwaffe, listening flights trying to taste the ether for secrets. At Ventnor, on the Isle of Wight, a young WAAF operator named Joan Kemp pressed a headphone tighter to her ear as static flared. The green line swept, heartbeat steadfast. A blip flickered. She jotted coordinates. Another blip, higher now, closer. Her supervisor leaned in. Check German base frequencies. Could be someone sniffing. The signal dipped, then climbed again. It danced, teasing. Not ours, too steady. That's no civilian. They reported it. Higher command marked it. Probable enemy aircraft, reconnaissance profile. The fighter squadron at Middle Wallop readied, but no scramble came. Orders were strict, only intercept when valuable. Preserve secrecy. Let Berlin think Britain deaf. A message drifted back through the chain. Good plot. Maintain watch. 5 words. Plain. But Kemp would later say she felt as though she'd been handed a medal. Then came altitude deception. German crews tried skimming waves. Chain home, crude by later standards, struggled, with low flyers. The engineers knew this weakness. They raced to solve it, even as reality pressed closer. Dowding listened to engineers' proposals for supplementary systems, CHL, chain home low, lower frequency sets, to fill the blind space beneath the main beams. He approved without hesitation. Towers doubled. Receivers multiplied. The wall thickened. One night at Bawdsey, while technicians soldered wire coils by lamplight. A pilot with a tired grin knocked frost from his cap and stepped inside for tea. "I hear you wizards can see through clouds," he said, accepting a steaming tin mug. Bowen looked up from a frequency chart. "We can see through arrogance," he replied dryly, "which is harder." The pilot laughed. But later, when sirens first wailed over British cities, many pilots would whisper privately that radar felt like witchcraft that worked. May 1940. The storm broke over the Low Countries. German armour rolled, paratroops fell like malignant seeds, refugees clogged roads, the world tilted. At Bentley Priory, Dowding stood before the great table map, Britain ghostlit in early morning gloom. Telephones rang in clipped bursts. Operators' hands shook slightly, but their voices held. "Sir," multiple echoes crossing Dutch coast, forming, bearing toward Channel. He exhaled. "The real war begins now." Plotters' rakes moved, filters hummed, towers pulsed eastward. Britain's eyes were open. In the months ahead, those echoes would be bombers in their thousands. Fire and ruin would cross the Channel. Fighter command would rise each dawn into battles measured in minutes and miles, and young men's lives. But because of the quiet work in fields and manors, because of green pulses on phosphor screens and women with steady hands and engineers refusing to blink before static, the Channel in June wore the colour of cold steel. Wind tasted of brine and foreboding. Britain had been pushed to the edge of itself. Dunkirk's beaches still haunted, boots and memory. Uniforms still smelled of salt, diesel, and smoke. On piers and railway platforms, families hugged men returned not victorious, but saved. A miracle, yes. Also a warning. The Wehrmacht stood across the narrow water. The Luftwaffe warmed engines. Radar hummed. Across the south coast, chain-home towers thrummed like giant tuning forks planted in chalk. They were ugly to some skeletal lattice masts and curtain antennas, but to those who understood, they were chapels of vigilance. They did not pray for peace. They demanded readiness. At Poling, dawn light seeped through instrument room slats, glinting off steel mugs and clipped hairpins. Leading aircraftwoman Evelyn Harper adjusted her headset, pencil poised. She had been a schoolteacher 12 months earlier. Now she listened for invasion. At Dunkirk, Kent, Sergeant Michael Nares cleaned dust from a cathode ray tube with the same reverence priests reserve for chalices. He murmured to the equipment as if coaxing it to loyalty. "Come on then, beauty. No jitter today. We'll have enough of that in the sky." It was not superstition. It was intimacy born of survival. Radar was delicate, temperamental, brilliant. It needed coaxing and care. And behind its hum lay the thin membrane between Britain and ruin. The first true test did not arrive as a sudden wave. It came as probes Luftwaffe formations feeling the edge of the net, counting towers, seeking silence. German crews flew at odd heights, strange headings, dragging shadows across displays and human nerves alike. Ventnor picked up one such probing raid before breakfast. Plot bearing 085, Angels 15, strength estimated 20+, came the steady WAAF voice. The map table came alive, rakes slid, chalk marks multiplied. At Group HQ, a controller lifted a telephone. "Scramble, 2 sections." Horns wailed across Tangmere. Pilots burst from huts, teacups abandoned mid-sip. Boots slapped earth. Merlin engines roared to life like unleashed lions. As Spitfires lifted, a quiet acknowledgement passed through operators' minds. We saw them first. Pilots did not think of the women and men in the dark rooms with headphones and chalk. They thought of engines, altitude, the sun's glare in perspex, formation discipline, the weight of 8 Browning machine guns. But beneath their wings flowed information radar-fed vectors, updated bearings, timing measured in seconds. Without that, blind climb, wasted fuel, missed intercept, surprise. With that, contact. High over Sussex farmland, contrails scratched white scars across blue. Radios crackled clipped commands. Germans jinked in shock at hurricanes appearing where none should be. The Luftwaffe withdrew, not defeated, not yet, but startled. They began to understand that Britain did not wait to see bombers. Britain knew. The summer heat arrived, and with it came the Battle of Britain proper. On July 10th, radar. Stations lit like Christmas under bombardment warning. Large raid forming over Calais. Filtering estimates, 50 plus, then 60, then 80. Squadron to readiness. Scramble. Vector 080 Angels 20. The sky filled. At Bentley Priory, Dowding watched his wall map bloom with hostile markers like blood spreading through linen. He clasped his hands behind his back. Discipline steadied him. He had fought committees for these towers, for these plotters, for this system no one had yet named but would one day call the Dowding System. It was not just radar. It was integration, communication, foresight, the first modern air defense network in history. Now, at last, it faced the crucible. Bombs fell, that July and August, on ports and airfields. Heat waves shimmered over tarmac while black columns of smoke rose where hangars once stood. Pilots sweated in cockpits, oxygen masks biting cheeks, arms bruised from recoil shock. Controllers lost voices, plotters' fingers cramped. At Ventnor, the Luftwaffe tried a new tactic: direct attack on radar. Stukas scream-dived, their sirens twisted joy into terror. Bombs exploded near the masts, ripping cables, flattening huts. Dust rained from control room rafters. Equipment shook, lights flickered. One operator cried out and clutched her headset. The radar returns vanished. For minutes, the station seemed dead. Then engineers' hair singed, hands bleeding crawled through rubble to reconnect feeds. They bypassed damaged circuits, cannibalized spare parts, rerouted power. Within 6 hours, Ventnor whispered to life again, faint pulse against the sky. The Germans believed it destroyed. It was wounded but seeing. When Fighter Command asked, "Ventnor status?" The reply came calm, "Operational." In mess halls and cramped huts, rumors circulated. The towers are useless. The towers are our only hope. Nobody knows how they work, except some wizard at Bordsey. Pilots joked darkly. Angels 20? No angels and vacuum tubes. But when they were vectored onto raids just in time, gratitude replaced doubt. Quiet gratitude, worn like a street. Christopher medal under uniform cloth. In late August, when the sun bled red over southern cliffs and smoke trails hung motionless in the thick evening air, a young WAAF named Margaret Cole wrote in her small ration paper diary, "We do not carry guns, we do not fly. We sit at tables and hold sticks. But we feel the sky. We feel the danger before it comes. We are the line between warning and surprise." She underlined one phrase 3 times. "We see them first." The battle would grow worse. London would burn. Towers would fall and rise again. But in that crucible, one truth hardened into iron. Invisible beams crossed the channel like watchful spears. Young women's voices guided squadrons into combat before bombs ever fell. A nation remained on its feet, not through luck nor miracle nor myth, but because Britain had learned, before the first great blow, to listen to the sky. By the first chill of autumn, London no longer slept in innocence. The Blitz was not a storm, it was a season and nightly harvest of fire. Sirens curdled the dusk, searchlights combed the clouds like pale, trembling fingers. Explosions beat through brick, through bone, through memory. And yet, even amid ruin, something profound had shifted. Britain was learning to hear the darkness. Radar had proven its value against daylight raids, but when the bombers came at night, low and cloaked in moonless sky, the old human senses faltered again. Ears strained, spotters peered upward, useless. Engines overhead might be 2 miles away or directly above. The sky swallowed certainty. In this crucible, a second revolution formed. Night interception guided by radar. Not the tall coastal towers alone, but new, rotating sets, crude yet determined, known by coded names like AMES Type 7 and GCI Ground Controlled Interception. They rose in inland fields, ringed by sandbags, huts, and blackout curtains. Their antenna arrays turned slowly, like mechanical shepherds scanning an invisible flock. At RAF Sopley, in Hampshire, a WAAF corporal named Alice Henson stood with headphones pressed so tightly they left red marks on her temples. Her voice was steady as she read bearings into the plotting room. Outside, cold dew seeped through grass and canvas. Inside, the room smelled of paraffin heaters and human tension. Track hostile bearing 067 20 miles, Angels 10. The plotter's rake slid, arrows updated. The air raid sirens in Portsmouth began to wail. A controller, a young man exhausted enough to tremble when he paused, but never when he spoke, leaned into the mic. Night fighter leader, Vector 085, target 10 miles ahead, Angels 10. Steady climb. In the black above the Hampshire fields, a Bristol Blenheim IF, engines thrumming hunted, nothing it could see. Its radar, a nascent, fragile airborne set known as AI Mark, IV, glowed like foxfire in the cockpit. Operator hunched behind the pilot, hands on cathode ray tube, voice taut. Still nothing. Still nothing. Hold. Contact faint. Starboard 5. Closing range. The pilot banked gently. No lights. No horizon. Only trust in dots of light, in voices far below, in the belief that technology and human nerve could carve precision from dark chaos. Range decreasing. 3,000 yards, now 2,000, slight port. Then the radar operator exhaled sharply. Visual. Target dead ahead, 2 o'clock high. A looming black shape materialized. The Blenheim eased closer, close enough to taste exhaust, to feel prop wash twitch. Machine guns spoke in short, precise bursts. Far below, Portsmouth streets heard a booming thud and saw orange flicker through clouds. One bomber less. One night survived. The Dowding System extended, itself like nerve tissue across the kingdom. Chain home for distance, CHL for low flyers, GCI for night direction, filter rooms for truth distilled from noise, observer corps filling the seams, fighter command at the apex lean, analytical, relentless. The Luftwaffe never knew it was fighting a network, not just planes, not just towers, a mind made of wires and voices. In Berlin, reports grew uneasy. Some German bomber crews whispered about uncanny British foresight. They called the searchlights that found them Hexenlicht, witchlight. But there were no witches. Only physics, patience, and young women with pencils. In December 1940, snow dusted the radar huts. Equipment hated cold. Valves crackled, wires stiffened, moisture condensed on steel chassis like sweat. Engineers improvised blankets around consoles, charcoal braziers for warmth, constant checks. Anything to keep the heartbeat alive. Robert Watson-Watt visited Sopley once during that winter. His coat looked heavier, his hair thinner, his eyes still burned with the urgency of someone who knew Britain lived on borrowed time each night. A young operator offered him tea, hands shaking slightly. "We're doing our best, sir." He nodded, tired warmth in his voice. "Your best," he said, "is rewriting war." When a bomber stream was plotted that night, and fighters vectored, and explosions thudded over Southampton docks, his breath caught. Not at death was expected, but at order amid terror, at knowledge where once had been groping. The Blitz was hell, but it was not surprise, and that distinction mattered more than historians ever fully captured. By spring of 1941, improvements accelerated. New frequencies, sharper beams, taller masts inland, mobile sets, better plotting boards. Night fighter squadrons fielded bowfighters with cannons instead of rifle-caliber guns, fangs in the dark. The GCI stations spoke with growing confidence. Turn. Starboard, steady, commence climb, target crossing left, engage. And bomber crews, once arrogant, began to die in confusion. In diaries recovered from downed German aviators, a phrase recurred, It is as if they know where we are before we arrive. They did. Because Britain, by wire, by valve, by courage, had built a thing unseen before. Radar was no longer a line on a map or a laboratory experiment. It was a sense, a new human faculty. And with each night saved by its whispering light, the island hardened in resolve. The bombs still fell. But so did the belief in Berlin that this island would break. In the dark, a new truth had taken root. The age of visible war was ending. The age of information had begun. When the last ashes of the Blitz drifted into gutters and grass, Britain did not exhale. It retooled. Bomb damage was swept, roofs patched, and behind blackout curtains, pencils scratched, soldering irons hissed, and something almost mystical whispered from laboratory benches and war rooms alike. The first great leap had been chain home. The next would be miniaturization, a word that tasted like sorcery. To see farther, lower, sharper, without towers planted like spears in chalk cliffs. To bring radar into fighters themselves, not merely as a whispering passenger, but as a hunter's third eye. The key lay inside a grey metal block that sat on a plain wooden table at Huts 16 and 30 at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, Malvern, the cavity magnetron. It did not look like a revolution. It looked like something a farm mechanic might forget in his toolbox. But when John Randall and Harry Boot refined its resonance cavities in February 1940, it emitted centimetric waves so powerful and so precise that the room seemed to hum with unseen thunder. Where earlier transmitters needed towers and acres, the magnetron could fit into a fighter's belly. Where earlier wavelengths skated like pebbles on radio, the waters, these pierced the night like scalpels. A new world of clarity opened. Engine oil glimmered on Randall's fingers the night the most stable prototype ran at full power. "It is absurd," he whispered, "that something this small can change a war." Boot only grinned, exhausted but bright-eyed. "It will make everything before it look prehistoric." They were right. Nothing in German labs matched it, not even close. That spring, a quiet order trickled down. Move the crown jewels, not to a vault to a nation across an ocean. The Tizard Mission had begun, an aircraft crate's worth of British secrets ferried to the United States jet research, proximity fuses, anti-submarine concepts, but the magnetron was the diamond among rubies. Crated, cushioned, guarded like relic bone, it crossed the Atlantic by cruiser and rail into the hands of astonished American engineers. In Boston, at the radiation laboratory at MIT, technicians unboxed it like priests opening a reliquary. One American officer, upon hearing its frequency and power rating, simply muttered, "Good God." A physicist scribbled calculations so quickly his pencil snapped. The Anglo-American Scientific Alliance was sealed not by treaty language, but by shared breath over oscilloscopes and coffee-stained notebooks. Radar was no longer British alone. It was allied. Britain, meanwhile, layered its shield thicker. Chain home still swept the horizon, tall and rigid. But now, little siblings sprouted. Chain home low, coast defence, mobile centimetric sets, truck-borne units disguised by tarps and scrub. Inland, the mysterious domes and masts of Ground Controlled Interception spun like patient lighthouses, searching night skies for bombers that hoped darkness still meant safety. In a hut near Foulness, a sergeant named Agnes Pierce listened to headphones while her fingertips hovered over a laminated plotting grid. She had learned to read signals the way a coastman reads tide. When a faint flicker suggested a raider skimming estuary waters, she tapped her pencil. Possible surface scatter, no. Aircraft. Heading west. Single. Fast. Her controller trusted her tone. Moments later, a Beaufighter was vectored, engine roar receding into the star-studded dark. Minutes later, somewhere above Essex farmland, cannons stitched the night. "I never saw him," the Beaufighter pilot later wrote. "I only heard the shells land, but someone saw first." While Britain sharpened sight, Germany dug deeper into belief. The Luftwaffe still trusted Freya and Würzburg, elegant but narrow-eyed. German scientists, clever, capable, lacked the magnetron and lacked the urgency that starvation warfare breeds in island minds. They built fighter bases, but not data webs, batteries of guns, but not networks of signal and voice. The Reich believed radar was a tool. Britain had made it a system. By late 1942, the RAF trained night fighter crews, who could read scopes, as instinctively as pilots once read clouds. Controllers no longer merely tracked raids, they managed a sky. They layered height, vectored angles, timed climbs, conserved fuel, integrated searchlights, anti-aircraft arcs, fighter sweeps, sonar on coastal craft, a cross-domain choreography no nation had attempted before. At Group HQ, a chalk dust-covered officer smoothed his tie and addressed new WAAF operators. "We do not fight pilots," he told them quietly. "We fight probability, we beat surprise, we buy time." Somewhere outside, the evening barrage balloon cables twanged in wind like harp strings. Engines of a returning patrol drummed a weary rhythm overhead. In the plotting hall, a girl no older than 19 drank tea gone cold as she tracked another blip, becoming a confirmed interception. There were no medals for these hours, no headlines, only log entries, tired smiles, and clogged bicycle racks outside canteen doors. But Britain had crossed a threshold invisible to bomber crews who still trusted the cover of dark. Radar, coastal, mobile, airborne tightened like a net woven from mathematics and human nerve. And as centimetric beams sharpened, the day approached when Allied fighters would not only see bombers, but U-boats in Atlantic swells, ships creeping in fjords, periscopes glinting in moonlight. The magnetron was not merely invention, it was prophecy, and the enemy had not heard it yet. Britain had begun the war listening for echoes. Now, it spoke in frequencies the world could not ignore. And across Europe, commanders who once scoffed at lattice towers and mysterious radio huts began to ask fearful questions they could not voice in public. If this is what Britain can do in defence, what happens when she goes on the offensive?